Well, when I came to the Department of Anthropology in 1967, as I said, I didn't have my PhD. I got it in 1968. Um, at the time, Cyril Belshaw was a senior professor. Uh, I was alone in having an interest in northern Athabascan cultures. The focus in the department, quite rightly, was Northwest Coast. Wilson Duff, as I said, was probably one of my most important colleagues. He was such a remarkable thinker, remarkably poetic man. He just and he was just a very, very nice man, very troubled in some ways, as we probably all know, and a visionary about trying to interpret, wanting to interpret the deep meaning of Northwest cultural art. And a lot of his colleagues, not at UBC but elsewhere, kind of disparaged his passion for trying to understand this deep meaning. There was a famous show that he curated called Images Stone BC, which later became a book. And it brought together photographs and descriptions of a number of important Northwest Coast, quote-unquote, sculptural objects, although, of course, the people who made them didn't think of them as sculpture. They were ceremonial, and more than ceremonial, they were real representations of important experiences and important mythical beings and mythical themes. But a lot of them Wilson interpreted, I think, quite correctly as either falliform or vulviform, like the seated human figure bowls. I think is pretty obvious. They're quite vulviform, and they were definitely used in female puberty ceremonies. So I think he was right on there. And similarly, some of the war clubs were falliform, and they look pretty falliform to me. And given that their usage and the symbolism, that also makes a lot of sense. And after the show and the book, there was a major conference at Simon Fraser University on bringing together a number of Northwest Coast people. And Wilson gave this absolutely impassioned, almost quivering. He had a sort of quivery way about him sometimes. It was just because of the intensity of his involvement. He was not just a academic anthropologist. He was just, deeply, deeply emotionally, personally connected with this quest for meaning. And he gave a talk that I think was the reaction to it was absolutely devastating. People were talking in the corridors behind his back, laughing, not really laughing at him, but making just disparaging remarks about, oh, well, there goes Wilson again with vulviform and falliform symbolism and so forth. And it wasn't long after that he took his own life. And I'm not sure if that was a reason, but it certainly represented the climate of opinion that fitted into other more personal issues that he was dealing with. So I just tremendously valued, even though I'm not a Northwest Coast person, I've never done ethnography on the Northwest Coast, I tremendously valued from my association with Wilson, even though it was only for, less than 9 years, 8 years, something like that. Ken Burridge was not there when I first came, and he came a couple of years later. And he represents an old school British social anthropology, and he was absolute master at teaching it. He was a fantastic teacher. he was just a really, really gripping lecturer. To all of his students just loved him, and I could see why. He had a good sense of humor too, and so he and I didn't have a whole lot in common in terms of our ethnographic interests. I was just beginning to publish. He probably kind of finished his publishing career. And that was a kind of an interesting thing. The senior people there were actually not publishing very much anymore. They kind of made their reputations from their early field work and their early publications, had gotten hired at UBC, and that they seemed to be more interested in teaching and going on to, as Belshel did, an administrative position. He was editor of Current Anthropology for a few years. David Aberley was the only other Athabascanist, but he was a Southern Athabascanist. He worked with the Navajo. Tell a funny story, though, just about the flavor of life in the department. That back in those days, department meetings were just hilarious. And everybody smoked back in those days. And not only smoked, they smoked big, fat cigars. And there was kind of like this macho competition about who could smoke the biggest, nastiest cigar in the department meeting. And Aberley also, he smoked cigarettes, but most other people smoked cigars. And Aberley had a way of, when it was time for him to make a statement, he would get the floor, he would pick up his pack of cigarettes, he would pull one out, he would light it, he would take a toke, and then he would wait. He would make everybody wait for, it seemed, an interminable length of time before he then made his statement. He held the floor. It was just kind of his way of doing things. It was a generational difference, you know. It's not just the smoking, but it was also fairly macho male oriented. Although I pretty much say Ellie Miranda and Elvie Whitaker definitely held their own in the department. I had a strong interest in mythology because essentially stories. I didn't really call it mythology. I just called it stories. And Ellie was very much more formal in her analysis of myths. She was very influenced by Vladimir Propp. And she and Pierre drew upon their own field experiences. So we kind of talked at cross purposes about mythology. I was just, from her perspective, she probably thought I was just prolix and going on, nothing but telling stories and no analysis. And from my point of view, it was, I can't stand all the analysis. Why don't we just go on and tell some stories? But we were all friends. It was a good collegial. There were really no enemies in the department at the time. But there wasn't a friendship in the way I know some other departments are, where people have dinner together and parties together and see each other socially all the time. For some reason, the UBC department just was not that way. We saw each other in the shop, and that was it. There was very, very little contact outside of that. One of my later colleagues, Julie Cruikshank, was formerly a student of mine. I've valued her as, and she, of course, is a Northern Athabascanist. I valued her as a student, and then even more as a colleague. And she wrote a book called The Social Life of Stories. So Julie was much more simpatico in terms of, she's interested in recording stories and listening and respecting the elders she worked with. So Julie and I have always been kind of on the same wavelength. And it was a treat to have her as a student, and it was even more of a treat to have her as a colleague. Michael Q is another one. Even though he was a Northwest Coast person, his office was right down the hall from mine. And we just had a really good, friendly relationship. We also had a love of boats. He had a boat, and I had a boat. So, and we had an interest in the BC coast just from that experiential point of view. And he was also, I sort of felt blessedly free of focusing more on theory than on ethnography. He was more focused on ethnography, and that was kind of where I was coming from as well. And as I said, when I was in the department at Harvard, the theories that were going on were in the social relations department, NATCH, which nobody's ever heard of anymore, and functionalism, Radcliffe Brown functionalism was still alive. I don't know if it was alive and well, but it was still taught, as an important theoretical orientation. And Lévi-Strauss was just writing structural anthropology, I guess, and structuralism became the big thing, and the Mirandas embraced that enthusiastically, and were instrumental actually in getting Lévi-Strauss to come and spend a semester at UBC, and that was fantastic to have him there. He and I never quite. We always thought he always thought I was a little strange, but probably interesting. But probably the best way of putting it. He was very friendly and everything, and I always thought he was really brilliant, but I couldn't always understand what he was talking about or writing about. So we didn't really have too many conversations about academic issues. There were some social contacts. There were while he was there, the Mirandas did have some social events with him, to which everybody was invited. So those are. Have I missed anybody? I should go back to Aberle. Aberle's interest was in something he called relative deprivation, and I'm not sure if I can even summarize it all. But he was interested in nativistic movements, and how nativistic movements were engendered not by absolute deprivation, but by feeling deprived in relation to either an imagined golden age, or the way you had been, or as a result of having been treated badly by colonial influence. He was very much an advocate of the Navajo. He was called upon to be an expert witness in some court cases. Although, as I recall, one of them was a complex one where it was Navajo versus Hopi. It's just that I hope never to be in that kind of situation. But he did testify on the behalf of the Navajo. And he was also interested in northern Athabascan prehistory and linguistics. And Aberle and Dian wrote this book on lexical reconstruction of Athabascan languages. And part of what Aberle wanted to prove was that originally northern Athabascans had been matrilineal, and I kind of think this was because the Navajo are matrilineal, and he sort of wanted. I mean, he would be rolling over in his grave now if he heard me saying this, but I kind of think he just wanted the original Athabascans. He wanted them to be representative of something that was deeply rooted in Athabascan prehistory. I think it's subsequently come out that it's way more complex than that. Jack Ives, for instance, wrote a book, I guess probably after Aberle passed away, certainly after he was actively writing, that's called A Theory of Athabascan Prehistory. He's a contemporary archaeologist, anthropologist. I don't know if you're going to interview him. He's worth talking to. He's doing archaeology in Navajo country right now, but he wrote this book, Theory of Athabascan Prehistory, that was very much very much used kinship information and was reconstruction of different kinds of kinship systems. There's two interesting chapters in that book where he compared my information about Dane-Zaa, the Dane-Zaa kinship system, with Michael Ash's description of the Slavey kinship system. And both systems are terminologically virtually identical, but the way the two cultures use them are quite different. And this was Ives' conclusion, among many other things. It's a complex, quite theoretical book, but of a kind of theory that I'm happy with. And for the Dane-Zaa, at least at the period when I was documenting them, they tended as much as possible towards an endogamous relationship. That is, a strong band will try to retain spouses for both male and female members of the band in order to keep the band strong. Sometimes you'll export them or allow them to go elsewhere, but as much as possible, there were a number of cases in my genealogy, a really large number, where marriages took place within the band, whereas Michael Ash showed a more sort of classic Lévi-Straussian exchange system where there was band exogamy, and women had to marry into another band, and the men had to import women from another band. And Jack Ives made some really interesting points about that. But overall, I think he found that there wasn't a whole lot of evidence. It wasn't necessarily even a terribly meaningful question to try to prove that original northern Athabascans had been matrilineal. And so Aberle seemed, he was really, really concerned with making this argument. And we never had arguments about it, but we knew, we knew he had sort of different perspectives. But again, he was gracious, but he also thought, Robin's he's just a storyteller. He just likes to go around telling stories. And although he appreciated the kinship paper that I wrote, one of my earliest papers was called a two-section system without sections. I did get into kinship theory, so that was probably my foray into kinship. I actually took a course in kinship at Harvard, so I did get really interested in it. And when I first did field work with the Dane-Zaa, I truly was amazed at all these things I'd read in books, which I always thought, they couldn't really be like that, but it's just the anthropologists making up these very formalized systems. And holy cow, they really do. And then I started trying to figure out why, how they work the system, how they work this kinship system, because kinship studies in anthropology are notoriously horrendous. They're the things that scare people in their PhD exams, being asked to explain Crow and Omaha kinship systems. They're just terrifying. And here are these people who are just living it, and no problem whatsoever. And it seemed to me, it's a classic bifurcate merging system where you separate cross cousins from parallel cousins. Cross cousins are people that you can marry or that your sibling can marry. Parallel cousins are brothers and sisters, siblings, simple. And their parents are either mothers and fathers, uncles and aunts, although there's special individual terms for those. In some ways, a very simple logical system. But then how do they work this system? And it seemed so obvious when I started hearing the stories and asking people about kinship. How do you know that this person is your brother? Well, it's not actually. It's really quite a distant brother. Oh, I know, because I call his father same as my father. I call his mother same as my mother. I don't know. I know what my parents called him. My parents called called his parent, his father, brother. So I know he's my brother. Well, how come your father called that person's parent his brother? He wasn't really a brother, was he? Oh no, he was just a cousin brother. And then as it got more into the details of the genealogy, I'd find that sometimes you'd have to go up like 3 or 4 generations and across and down again. Complex actual relations. But all you had to know was what your parents called the parents of the other person. That was your reference point, and it all fell into place. And for the most part, the marriages actually took place were pretty consistent with you don't marry people you call siblings, and you do marry people you call the cross-cousin terms. One of the things I'd like to do now is actually kind of re-look at contemporary marriages, because they're not using that kinship, the native terms anymore, although they are using brother and sister for people who are terminologically brother and sister, not biologically. I'd like to see to what extent the marriages are still consistent with the system that I described, but that's another project. Let's see. Oh, I wanted to talk a little bit about my involvement with the Omaha tribe. So this goes back to my days at Harvard. I should point out that every ethnographic experience I've had has flowed from some important personal experience. It's nothing I've just kind of looked on the map and said, oh, okay, I'd like to go study those people. It's always something like my friends at Swarthmore taking me up to the Dane-Zaa country. That's what got me into anthropology. That's what got me into working with the Dane-Zaa. Well, when I was at Harvard, one of the first things I saw in this dusty old 4-story Peabody Museum, big old brick building on Divinity Avenue, full of, at that time, it was just a classic, old-fashioned 19th century museum full of curiosities, dusty curiosities. And one of the dusty curiosities was right between the department library and the department office, right on the main floor. And it was a glass case, a big, tall glass case, and in it was the sacred pole of the Omaha tribe. And on the floor of the case were all the sacred bundles that went with this sacred pole. And they were all open. And it kind of shocked me, even though the Dane-Zaa they have medicine bundles, personal medicine bundles, but they don't have tribal emblems like that. But it shocked me that this is something that had tremendous cultural, spiritual meaning. And here it was, just in a glass case with very perfunctory labeling, identifying it as Sacred Pole of the Omaha tribe. No attempt to explain what it was, let alone the fact that they had the audacity to put it on public display like that. So I kind of got interested in it, and I'm part of my training for my work for my comprehensive exams was reading a lot of ethnography, especially classic, older ethnography. And one of the ethnographies, Bureau of American Ethnology, has been a huge, important influence on me. And one of these was called The Omaha Tribe by Alice Fletcher and Frances LaFlesche. And Alice Fletcher was probably the first female anthropologist, and Frances LaFlesche was one of the first Native American anthropologists. And it was an amazing book. It's the 27th annual report of the BAE, published in 1911. When it came out, it was reviewed by Lowy, who is my thesis advisor's advisor, so he's like my academic grandfather, I guess. And Lowy said, "This is a terrible book. It doesn't have any theory in it whatsoever. It's just ethnography." Psh, wrote it right off. And there it sat. Just no one paid any attention to it. It doesn't have any theory. It just ethnography, just kind of sitting there. like in the dusty case, and between the covers of this dusty old 1911 book. So I started reading it, and I discovered, whoa, this is amazing. The amount of information that they have. They translated sacred songs and prayers and texts from Omaha, which Francis was a native speaker, and they translated them in what later we would call an ethnopoetic form, line for line, with a literal translation, the Omaha, and then a literal translation, and then a poetic translation. Very, very modern concept now. And beautiful beautiful ethnographic poetics. I didn't have the term at the time, but later with Jerome Rothenberg and Dennis Tedlock, they coined those terms of anthropological poetics. But I was just fascinated by this book. But then I went on and got my job at UBC, got involved in teaching, ended up with a different marriage to Jilian, who will be on the scene here later. So I kind of put that Omaha experience on the back burner, but I still kept thinking about it. So at some point, I decided, well, I'll look at the book. I'll look at the 27th Annual Report. Again, it was such an interesting book, and the pole is still sitting there in the Peabody Museum. And again, I was just fascinated, and enough so that I had a Sherrick grant, and one of the things that I included in it was working with the Dane-Zaa, but also doing some research in the National Anthropological Archives in Washington on Francis LaFlesche and Alice Fletcher. And I discovered a lot of unpublished material there. But even more important, I discovered that there had been an Omaha anthropologist working in the archives not too long before. So I got his name, phoned the tribe, got him on. First of all, I sent him a letter to the tribal office, and I'd written a paper by that time. It was called A Sacred Symbol of the Death and Birth of a Sacred Symbol, the Sacred Pole of the Omaha Tribe. And at that point, I thought, it had been this wonderful, this alive thing within the culture, and now it was dead as a doornail, killed by an anthropologist. And I sent it to Dennis Hastings, the tribal historian. And he phoned me immediately, and he said, "You really shouldn't be writing about us till you know us. You better come down here. We're having a tribal powwow in a few weeks. So, more or less, get your ass down here and see what's going on." So Jilian and I did, camped in a little pup tent in absolutely outrageously hot, humid weather, and met with Dennis and hit it off with him really well. And we decided that we would collaborate together. And it turned out that the sacred pole had been taken out of public display, but was just in the basement of the Peabody Museum. And we decided to work with the then tribal chairman, Doran Morris, and to see if the tribe could repatriate. This was after NAGPRA, the Native American Graves Repatriation Act. And decided to see if we could do something about repatriating it to the Omahas. So Doran Morris and a former tribal chairman, Eddie Klein, arranged. I helped them negotiate this with then director of the Peabody, Lambert Karlowski, to visit the sacred pole. He was still, and I call him he because he was definitely the male principal of the Omaha tribe. And the Omaha tribe had this very strong Lévi-Straussian dual organization. Lévi-Strauss loved the Omahas because of their dual organization, and half of the tribe was essentially male, half the tribe was female. The camp circle called the Huthaga was divided into a number of clans, the Sky People and the Earth People. And one of the clans was called the Leader Clan. And Doran, and the traditional keeper had to be a member of the Leader Clan. Doran, the contemporary current tribal chairman, was a member of the Leader Clan. So it seemed appropriate for him to try to renew contact with him, the Omaha, which is his name, which means the real Omaha. So we arranged for a visit to the Peabody Museum, and when we got there, it took a long time. We were waiting outside. They were going to bring the pole outside into a little courtyard where they could have a little ceremony. We waited a long time. It seemed like a very strange long time. And I later learned from Ian Brown, who was one of the curators at the Peabody, that this utterly strange thing had happened. They put the sacred pole into the elevator and pressed the button for ground floor. The elevator had gone up to the 5th floor. They pressed the button again for the ground floor. The elevator had gone back to the basement, and they kept shuttling back and forth, back and forth. He said, it's never happened before. I couldn't figure out. It was really spooky. So finally they got to the ground floor, and we were there, Doran and Eddie Klein and I and Jilian, and they performed a little ceremony. It was incredibly moving. It was the first time that Omaha, the real Omaha, had been outside, had experienced fresh air and sky, even though it was in the courtyard of the Peabody Museum. And they prayed over him, and then began to go. And this was 1988, which was exactly 100 years after he had gone into the Peabody Museum. And negotiations continued, and in fact, in 1989, he was repatriated. And I should just tell another little story about what happened 100 years previously, when Frances LaFlèche and Alice Fletcher wanted to take the pole to the Peabody Museum, which is where she had a fellowship there, so she was essentially on staff of the Peabody Museum. There had been a lot of pressure from the missionaries to simply destroy all the sacred objects. They considered them heathen and backward. And she was enough of a good anthropologist to think it should be preserved. I don't know whether she really believed in the life of the pole. Certainly Frances did. And so they talked to Shudinachi, the last keeper, and convinced him that the only way to save the pole was to take him for safekeeping. They clearly said not to own, but for safekeeping, to the great brick house in the east. And so he finally agreed. And then they said, but without knowing the story of the origins of the pole, we want to be able to include that in the book that we're going to be writing. They didn't actually publish the book till 1911. This was 1888. But he said, this is so powerful that normally the story can only be told in ceremony, and there's a renewal ceremony every year in which the wife of the keeper has to shoot 7 sacred arrows into an earth altar that is in the shape of the Huthaga, and it's also like the shape of the cosmos. And if she fails, if one of them doesn't stick in the ground properly, all hell will break loose. The bison won't come. The hunt will be unsuccessful. It will be awful. So it's really fraught with a lot of tension. And the renewal ceremony also required long recitation of text. And if the keeper made one little mistake, he had to go back and start all over again. So it was an awesome responsibility. And if anything went wrong, it would at least impinge badly upon the people who were responsible and maybe on the whole tribe. So Shudinachi said, I'm not sure if I want to take this responsibility, because if I told it and it was the wrong thing to do, something bad would happen to you, Francis, and to this white lady from the Peabody Museum, and I don't want that on my conscience. And at that point, Iron Eyes, who was Francis's father, who had been a previous chief, but was in he was in a faction called, he had a village called the Village of the Make-Believe White Men. He was an assimilationist. But he said, I'll take responsibility. If anything bad is going to happen from telling the story, let it happen to me and not to my son and this white lady. So for 2 days, Shunachi sat with Francis and Alice and told the story of the origin story of the sacred pole. They wrote it down. It's now in the 27th annual report. And 2 weeks later, Iron Eyes died. And it was so spooky. It was just, I mean, spooky things happen around the sacred pole. And I can't say anything more other than that was what was reported in the 27th annual report. So it's presumably factual. It's what really happened. So we knew we were taking on an awesome responsibility. Dora knew that, to bring the sacred pole back. And there was a lot of apprehension in the tribe at the time, who felt that if it hadn't been done, if it couldn't be done with the proper ceremony, which Doran wasn't, he wasn't a keeper, he didn't know all the ceremonies, he was the right clan, but that was it. If it wasn't done properly, something awful would happen to the tribe. And they actually didn't want to have him on the reservation. They just were afraid of consequences. So Dennis was able to negotiate a relationship with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. They have a museum there, and in which among other things has holdings of the remains of a number of people that had been in a village that was excavated some years ago. Which was later a subject of a NAGPRA repatriation. So anyway, they negotiated with the museum, and the university agreed that they would be a neutral caretaker, and so he went to the University of Nebraska Lincoln, UNL, and as far as I know, he's still there. Upon request by members of the tribe, they can visit him, and I think they do from time to time. And it appears that the fears have been quelled, but nobody really wants to take on the responsibility of bringing him. He's totally different than anything like a totem pole. He's about the height of a man. He's a cottonwood pole. He has a scalp lock hanging from him. And he's very falliform to you. Wilson Duff would have liked that. He's definitely a man. And his name is Wathokti. And amazingly, the same name, Wathokti, is used for the mark of honor that is tattooed on the daughter of a chief who has accomplished a ceremonial 100 worthy actions for the benefit of the tribe. And when we were there, we interviewed a couple of women who were the last ones who had this mark of honor tattooed on them. So again, it's the Omaha balance of complementarity of male and female, earth and sky. The mark of honor, and the women who became who had the mark of honor were members of a society that were almost like a religious order. Like they took care of orphans and families in distress. They were kind of like a social service organization, and so their power was the female power of the tribe, and the same name and a symbol relevant to that name as the sacred pole, which was the symbol of the male principle of the tribe. So all of this was, it was just fascinating, and it all came from walking by a dusty glass case in the Peabody Museum. And I'm still in touch with with Dennis, but I haven't been back since I've had a SSHRC grant, since I've not applied for additional SSHRC grants. More recently, the work that I've been doing has actually been funded by the Dane-Zaa as much as anything. I can talk about that. I should talk about that when Jilian comes down, because we've done all that together. So I haven't applied for a SSHRC grant for a while, and as a result, I haven't been back among the Omahas, and I've kind of lost touch except with Dennis.